Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Pen Habit. I have, over the last couple of years, gotten many requests to put together a couple of videos on how I adjust my pens. Now, there are lots of other videos out there by people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am. But I have developed a kind of process that I go through on the pens that I get that need work done, and so I wanted to go through that with you. Now, before we start, and you'll get this on every video that I do in this little mini-series here, please be aware that if you do any of the things I'm about to describe, you will void the warranty on your pen, and you will very likely, well, not very likely, there is a possibility that you could damage your pen beyond repair. So, please do not hold me responsible. Well, I refuse to take responsibility for any damage you do to your pen on the basis of following my advice on these videos. We'll put it that way. If you undertake any of these adjustments, you undertake them at your own risk. Just be aware of that. I've only damaged one of my pens beyond repair, and that was by using a technique that I don't use anymore. But just be aware that the way I do things is a little different than the way I've seen other people describe them done. And so you'll want to make sure you go slowly and you're very careful with anything you do that you see me do in these videos as you're learning to adjust your pens. That being said, let's talk a little bit about the theory of adjusting your pen. So the way I look at it, there are basically three ways, there are three attributes you have to look at when you're trying to adjust your pen to make it write the way you want it to write. The first is the ink flow. So if your pen has a very heavy ink flow, it's going to naturally feel smoother because it's got more lubrication to glide across on the page. If you don't have very much ink flow, if it's a very dry pen, it's going to feel less smooth just by default. So I always like to start with ink flow. That's usually the first thing I look at and try to adjust, and I'll explain why in a little bit. After I've got the ink flow relatively to where I want it, the second attribute I look at is alignment. Are the tines in alignment in all directions? Are they in alignment? If they're not, and I'll show you this, I've got a nifty new camera I'll show you in just a little bit, but if they're not in alignment, you can get some scratchiness that is very unpleasant. And then the third attribute that I like to pay attention to is the polish on the tip of the nib. So if the tip of the nib is not well polished, you're going to get not a scratchy necessarily, but a feedbacky feel. And if you're one of those people like me who likes a very smooth feel to their nibs, that may bother you. First, let's talk about ink flow. Now, I mentioned that ink flow is the thing that I like to talk about first. And the reason I like to talk about ink flow first is because in adjusting the ink flow, you have the possibility of throwing the alignment out of whack. So you want to make sure that you do the ink flow first. So once you've got the ink flow working the way you want it to, then you can go adjust the alignment. But if you try to do the alignment first and then adjust the ink flow, you will almost 100% of the time throw the alignment out of whack. So let's start with this pen. So I've already done a review of this pen. This is the Hero 901. It's a very inexpensive Chinese pen. It's actually my father's pen. He sent it to me or allowed me to borrow it for a review. And this pen had multiple problems. It is scratchy and it's very dry. And so I want to tackle both of those things. So I'm going to go to the overhead camera here, and you can see I've already done a little bit here. But the first thing I like to do when looking at a pen is I actually do a series of crosshatches to get a sense of where the scratchiness is. So I'll do downstrokes and cross strokes in both directions. And I get a really unpleasant scratchiness when I go this direction. So that leads me to believe that maybe the tine on the right-hand side is a little out of alignment. Then I do up. That's pretty good in both directions. And again, going left, it's a problem. Then what I will do is I will do some diagonals. So I'll go this way. So this one was quite smooth. This one was not. This downward is probably the scratchiest so far, and then I'll do the diagonals going up. So that's a little scratchy, and that is moderately scratchy. So, and then just to kind of round it off, I'll do that loop-de-loop thing. It's just a very scratchy problem. Now, one of the things that I've done already is I've taken a quick look at the alignment. It's not too bad, but I know I'm going to have to adjust it later, as I mentioned. So I'm going to start dealing with ink flow. So if you'll notice here, if I do my little ink test, it's very dry, very, very dry. So there are a couple of different ways to handle ink flow. One of the ways that I have seen most often is, let me go to the overhead camera here, is if you hold your finger against the tip of the nib and using your thumbnail or some other hard surface, very slowly bend the tip of the nib down to separate the tines slightly. That's one way to do it. It is not my preferred method. The reason for that is I don't, to me, it's too easy to spring the nib, especially if you've got a gold nib. It's too easy to do it not quite right. So I take a slightly different approach. But I'm going to switch over here to a new camera. So I want you to take a look here at the nib. And you can see this is the nib, and it's from the breather hole, there's a fairly wide channel. And then as it gets to the tip, it's very, very tight. Sorry, probably getting seasick from watching this, but so it's very, very tight as you get toward the tip of the nib. So that's probably the first thing to look at. Now, if I were to do that thing where I take the tip and actually bend the nib open, that would probably solve the problem, or get me a lot closer. What I like to do instead is to take one of these. This is a brass shim. I believe I got this from Goulet Pen Company. It's 2 micron. I don't know exactly the measurement, but it's a very thin piece of brass. And if you can, I like to remove the nib. So I'm going to just go ahead here and grab my towel and pull the nib straight out. Just set this aside for the moment. Actually, before I do that, let me pull the converter out and make sure I've got it propped up so it's not leaking anywhere. So I have gotten the ink out of, or gotten the nib and the feed. I just pulled it straight out. And I'm going to clean these off just a little bit because I like to work on ink flow on nibs out of the pen. And you'll see why here in just a second. So I'm going to go back under the microscopic camera here and show you on a piece of paper what this looks like. Okay, so here's the underside of the nib, and you can see the nib slit gets much, much, much narrower. So there are a couple ways we can deal with this. One way that I have found that I like to do, so if you're looking at the nib head on, right from the tip, sometimes you'll see the nib, you see how the two parts of the nib are very tight together. There's just a very slight increase in the gap at the bottom, but at the top it's very, very tight together. And the tip of the nib, as we expect, is very tight together. So if this is the tip of the nib, sometimes you'll see the nib like this. This is okay. Sometimes you'll see it like this. This is not okay, because that means that the top of the nib is where the ink is trying to escape, not the bottom. Ideally, the gap would be like this, where it would be right, there'd be a gap in between the two pieces. But if you can do that, sometimes that will get you where you need to go. So one of the things I will do, I'm going to move my pad out of the way here and show you my scarred up table, is I will actually, you can do this a couple of different ways. You can actually grab the shoulders of the nib and pry it open a little bit, like that. Or sometimes I will actually just put the nib down on the table and press very slightly on the shoulders. And what you will see, you may see, is that we're starting to get a little bit of a gap there in the nib. Now, you can see that the tines are out of alignment, which is why I said we don't want to deal with alignment until we've got the ink flow issue resolved. So I'm going to go ahead and bend this open a little more. And it's better, but it's still not quite as much as I want. So what I'm going to do next then is I'm going to go ahead and take this brass shim. I'm actually going to floss it. You can do it a couple of different ways. You can go from the breather hole up, or if you're a glutton for punishment, like I sometimes am, I actually try to go in at the top here, and I'll show you why. Now, so I've got this brass shim in here. Now you can do a couple of things with this. You can either, floss it a few times, which will sometimes help a little bit. If I just try to floss the inside a little bit with this brass shim, and we go back and look at it under the microscopic camera, it's a little better. There's a little bit more of a gap. But actually, what I prefer to do, I'm going to go ahead and put this back in. There we go. And I will take the nib and just rock back and forth slightly. You can see what I'm doing here is just rock back and forth very slightly, holding the brass shim right by the tip of the nib. I'm putting a little extra pressure on the shoulders of the nib at the same time. And what I'm hoping that will do is open up the tines just a little bit more. So now let's go back and take one more look at that. Okay, so we're getting a little better. If I go look at the top of the nib now, it's still pretty tight. Still a little more tight than I would like. So I'm going to repeat this a few more times. So this time I'm going to be a little bit more forceful with pushing that open and spreading the tines apart with my thumbs here. Take a look under the camera. Okay, and it's got a little bit more of a gap again. And this is really key. You want to make sure that you're checking your work often. Now, to check your work, in case you don't have a microscopic USB camera like I do, I use these. So I will take my glasses off and put this on. This is a 20X loop I bought from a pen repair place, a pen supply place, has a little light on it. And now I look like a member of the Borg. And I will look at the nib up close in the loop here. Now it's getting better, but it's still not there. So I'm going to repeat this a couple more times, flossing the nib and trying to spread the tines apart. Go slowly here. This spot, probably more than any other spot, is where you run the potential of ruining the tip of your pen. Now, I'll give you a horror story here quickly. I actually destroyed a vintage pen nib, a Conway Stewart nib, by trying to use pliers to do this. And those of you who have done this kind of work before probably all just cringed. Don't use pliers ever for this kind of stuff. This is handwork. Unless you're a master, don't ever touch your nib with pliers, or unless it's a nib you don't care about, to get practice. So I'm going to go ahead and keep flossing this nib very slightly and see if we can't open up the channel here. Try to spread that nib tip open just a little bit more. Rock it back and forth. Floss it a couple times. There we go. Now, it's getting better. It's still not exactly where I want it to be. So now is where, after I've done this a couple of times, if it's still not quite as wet as I want, or not quite as wide as I want, now's when I actually do the trick that you've seen in the other videos. Sometimes this isn't necessary, but I will take, and it's actually easier to do if you put it back in the pen for this final step. So I'm going to go ahead and take the nib and the feed, put those back together here. You can see just putting the nib and the feed together, grab the section. Sometimes it slides in, sometimes you have to find a specific way to get it to slide in, and push it back together again. So there you see we've got it together. And the reason it's easier to do it with this back in the pen is that it gives you a little bit more leverage. So I'm going to go ahead and put my thumb, you can see here, put my thumb on the very or my finger on the very tip of the nib. And I'm just going to use the desk, and I'm going to press very slightly to open up the tips of the tines. Back to the camera, see how we're doing here. Okay, so you may be able to see here. There's actually a nice gap in these tines. So that's what I'm looking for. The ink will now be able to flow through that gap a lot more easily than it did before. But you'll notice now the tines are really, really out of alignment. So that's the next video, which will come out shortly. But basically, that's what we've got to do. That's why I don't recommend doing the alignment first. Do the nib spacing first. And what you'll find is, if you do this with ink connected to your pen, besides getting ink all over your fingers, which is totally fine, you'll be able to learn really quickly what gap works for the way that you like to write and for the wetness that you like. So now let's just, let me go ahead and really quickly put the ink back on the nib here. And I know it's going to be scratchy, but I'm going to just prime the pump a little bit by forcing some ink through here. I know it's going to be scratchy, and that's fine, because what I want to do now is just make sure that the ink flow is where I want it. And if it's not, then I can go ahead and make a couple more adjustments. And let's check the wetness on this baby now. Well, I can tell you already, it's significantly wetter. Yeah. So there you go. Now, if you, I'll go back and cut in a little bit of the original camera here, or the original footage, but that's what it looked like before. Here's what it looks like now. You can actually see a small gap in the nib. So that will give you a really solid indication of what you're looking for. And if you look at the nib body, you'll notice, from the top of the nib, you'll notice that the nib keeps a pretty consistent line all the way from the breather hole to the tip. And you're probably getting seasick from this microscopic camera. I apologize. I'm learning how to use it. But that's basically how you increase the wetness of your pen. Now, if you want to decrease the wetness of your pen, you can always squeeze the shoulders back together to try to bring the tip back together. You can do the reverse on the issue where you flip the nib upside down, hold your finger against the tip, and bend it down a little bit. That will work. You can also, and I've done this on occasion, if you hold it on the side, if you get a flat piece of hard surface here, and you actually, what I do is I hold the tip of the pen against the hard surface and drag it down with a fair bit of force. Basically what I'm doing is I'm bending the tip back together and bending the tip back together this way. So I do it on each side, and then I adjust the alignment again. So that's a really solid way of going and getting rid of some excess wetness if you've got a pen that's particularly wet. Now, what this does not do for you is, if you've got a problem with your feed, if you've got a design problem with the pen that's causing ink starvation, this won't fix that. All this does is fix the issue with the ink getting to the tip of the nib. And I'll say about 90% of the problems I have with pens not writing wet enough, it's not an ink starvation problem, it's not a vacuum problem, it's not an ink flow problem in the feed. It's actually a problem in the tip of the nib, from that slit that runs from the breather hole to the tip of the nib. So that's how to adjust the wetness of your pen the way I do it. I'm sure other people have other ways to do it, but having the experience that I've had, that's the way I tackle it. Coming up next, we're going to talk about adjusting the alignment of your pen. So thank you for watching, and we will see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Bye.